Welcome along to another episode of In Conservation With. I really love this series of conversations because I get to talk to some really interesting people and people that I've always wanted to sit down and say, right, let's talk about this subject, this piece of sort of minute information for an hour. And I love all that because it really, you very rarely get the opportunity to do that. So this is the opportunity to talk to some great people and also great friends. And I must say, I got one with me, and his name is Stephen Menzie. We've known each other for a long time. If you want to know all about how we knew each other, you need to look at a previous In Conservation With, which what happened a few weeks ago. But if you're watching this in the future on YouTube, then just scroll down, you'll find him. And by the way, if you are watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Tell all of your friends, everyone, tell a few of your enemies as well. Tell everyone and get everyone to come and watch the wealth of information. There's so much you can learn on In Conservation With in terms of the subjects we've covered. And today we are going to be talking about Falsterbo, the bird observatory in Sweden. But firstly, Stephen, how are you and where are you?
Hello, David. I'm very, very well. Happy New Year as well. It's the last days of January, so I think we can get away with still saying that since I saw you last. So at the moment, I'm at home in Malmö, which is southern Sweden, which is just about 35 minutes drive from the place we're going to be talking about this evening.
Yeah, because the place you're talking about this evening is actually, I don't know if you recognize the scene behind me, but this is me looking back on Falsterbo and flying over here is
There you go.
honey buzzard. I've spent many, oh, well, let's say many, about 5 or 6 different seasons. I mean, when I say seasons, 5 or 6 autumns in Falsterbo at the bird fair, but watching the amazing number of raptors flying through. But you're going to tell us all about that. Falsterbo is an amazing place, and
Yeah,
you know what? I'm going to let you just tell us about Falsterbo.
super. Let's go. Let's pull up the presentation and then we can get started. So yeah, honey buzzards certainly feature. Right, there we go. Hopefully you can see that. Give a thumbs up. Perfect. So this is Falsterbo, Falsterbo Lighthouse. It'll become clear in a minute where exactly this is located. But I first visited Falsterbo in 2010. Actually, a friend David just mentioned the Falsterbo Bird Show. A friend of mine was working at the bird show and suggested I came over for a couple of days. And well, little did I know that that would lead to several years of employment there, and then eventually a full move across from the UK to Sweden. So I worked as a ringer, as a bander at the Bird Observatory between 2012 and 2015. Took a little bit of time out back in London, and then made a permanent move across here in 2020, March 2020. And we all know what happened in March 2020. So came across the bridge from Denmark into Sweden, and a couple of days later, the borders were closed. And there I was stuck here. Arguably worse places to be stuck for that period. And yeah, when I was across here, I settled. I became very comfortable living here, and here I am to this day. So where is Falsterbo? There we've got the map of the Northern Europe with the Nordics there, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. And Falsterbo is right down here at the very southern tip of Sweden. Or I should say the southwesternmost tip, since by about a quarter of a mile there's another point further south. But we're right down there, the very last bit of land in Sweden. It's famous for several things. It's famous for its lighthouse. Most Swedes locally will know the lighthouse. Distinctive shape, built in 2 parts. The lower part was built first with a coal-powered light on top, and then the tower came a little bit later. Falsterbo is also famous for its beaches. Anybody who lives here in Malmö at some point will have been down to the beach in summer. It's famous for its golf courses. Like every good birding location, it has good golf courses, including the second oldest in Sweden, Falsterbo Golf Club. Horses, it hosts every year Falsterbo Horse Show, which is what inspired the name Falsterbo Bird Show. The horse show came first, but very, very prestigious horse show. And of course, what we're going to be talking about this evening, the birds, and particularly migrant birds. So the first mention of Falsterbo in a sort of natural history context was 1749, and that was Linnaeus who came down to the peninsula. But he didn't note anything about the birds here. He mentioned the flora, but he didn't say anything about the fauna. And it wasn't until 1819 that there was any record of the birds on the peninsula. And that was a sort of rather vague mention of the area being quite good for wading birds, for shorebirds. More famously, during that period, during the 1800s, was the peninsula's salted honey buzzards. I said the honey buzzards would feature in this talk, so here we go. Here's the first mention of them. And allegedly, these salted honey buzzards were the best salted honey buzzards in the world, and sailors would call in and they would stock up as they were passing by. I'm not sure where else was providing salted honey buzzards and what they were compared to exactly, but there we go. That's what it was famous for. It wasn't then until about 1938, 1939 that real ornithological studies started at Falsterbo. And you can see in this photo the lighthouse there in the background. This is down at the southern tip of Falsterbo. And this photo is labeled a group of Danish ornithologists stalking a dunlin. So not sure what they're planning to do next, but there we go. They're stalking a dunlin down at Falsterbo. And the area was noticed by Gustav Rudebeck, who set up ornithological studies on the peninsula. And what he noticed was that a lot of birds were passing through in the autumn, in the fall. If you take a look at the map, you can start to see why that's the case. Birds generally, particularly when they're traveling in their first year of life, their first autumn, they don't want to cross the ocean. There are certainly narrower points to cross than Falsterbo, as we'll see on this map when we zoom in, but it's almost a case of better the devil you know. Stick over land and maybe eventually it will connect to some more land. So most birds will stay over land if they can. And that means that generally birds start to get funneled down here into southern Sweden before they continue on their way south and west. If we take a closer look at that, you can see that that channels them down into Skåne. Skåne's this region, this sort of sticky out square at the bottom of Sweden, just across from Copenhagen, before they then continue across southern Denmark. Even within Skåne, you get this sort of filtering and concentration effect. So some birds do cross further up, particularly if the winds are favorable, but a lot of birds will continue either down the west coast there or down the south coast. You can just see the map of Malmö there. So that's where I am currently, and then Falsterbo is where this star is. Once birds reach the peninsula, you get further concentrating. So birds that are traveling along the south coast end up sort of along the south edge of the peninsula here. And then birds that are coming down the west coast end up coming down the north and then eventually the west side of the peninsula until they meet at the star. And the star is the lighthouse. That's the southernmost tip of mainland Falsterbo Peninsula. There's some spits and islands further on. And that's where the main action happens. You have this concentration of two streams of migration meeting at that point. The migration is not so pronounced in spring, partly because there are fewer birds. We touched on this in the last time I was here, talking about the sort of survival rates of birds and so on, but also just the lay of the land. You can see if you're a bird heading north, you're more likely to head up through Denmark and across through Skagen and into Scandinavia that way. So spring at Falsterbo is a nice place, but it's not that same concentrated migration as in autumn, as in fall. So here we go. Here are the studies with Gustav Rudebeck, starting in 1939 and introducing sort of standardized counts of birds between 1942 and 1944. And that took note of the species that were passing, and the number that were passing. Up until this point, this wasn't known. And there was a break in these counts, and then in 1974 they started up again, and they continue to this day. So we have an unbroken series of counts from the Falsterbo Peninsula since 1974. So why do we do this? Why do we continue to do this year on year? Well, as I said, in the early days, we were working out what species were passing. That was largely unknown at the time, and also working out the numbers that were passing. What we're able to do with such a long series of data is to work out trends in populations, really. And keep in mind that many of these birds are migrating from areas that are not particularly well studied. And so this gives a sort of proxy for how the populations are doing on the breeding grounds. So here we go. Here's a flock of linnets flying by, and here's the graph for the number of linnets. There's peaks and there's troughs, but overall this population is probably staying fairly stable. The peninsula also became a centre for ringing, for banding, and increasingly that started to take place from the 1960s onwards. And then in 1980, there was a standardised ringing scheme set up. And that continues to this day with the same dates, I'll say the same nets, the same number of nets in a similar place, at least. And that takes place for a couple of months in the spring, and then a few months in the autumn, a few months in the fall. And again, by doing this sort of standardized is perhaps too strong a word because things change, but this systematic ringing, we're able to get a good idea of the birds passing through and the population. So some of you may be aware of what ringing is. For others, it might be a new concept. The bird is caught in these fine nets that you saw in the last slide there, and we put a lightweight aluminium ring on its leg, and that ring has a unique number that allows that bird to both be logged in the database. In Sweden, it's held by the Natural History Museum. In the UK, it's held by the British Trust for Ornithology. And not only does it allow that bird to be logged and sort of uniquely catalogued, it also means that if that bird is found somewhere else, then that bird and its data can then be reported. And we start to know where the birds have moved to. And fundamentally, that was the reason for ringing birds, was to work out where did they go. Here's a common white-throat, and nobody particularly knew where these birds were going to, and particularly different populations, until they were ringed and we started getting these ringing recoveries of where the birds had gone. But there's a whole lot more that we can work out from doing this ringing work. We can work out where birds are going at a particular time of year. So if you'll forgive the slight difference in the maps here, I'll explain why. Top left here is blue tit. We'll see some photos of these later. And blue tits that pass through Falsterbo actually don't tend to move very far. You see, we've got a record from down in Belgium, a few from the Netherlands and Germany, but most of the birds that we catch migrating, most of the blue tits we catch migrating through Falsterbo end up somewhere in Denmark, and they'll often come back to Sweden to breed somewhere in southern Sweden. One's gone to Russia, one's gone to Finland, but they're the exceptions. This bottom map here is barn swallow. And so you can see actually barn swallow has a much greater long distance migration. One's gone to the UK, but most of the birds that have been re-caught, re-seen after they've been ringed, have been on their migration either heading south or heading back north. We've got a record down there from South Africa even. We also have a sandwich tern ringed at South Africa that was re-caught at the Bird Observatory. And then this one up on the top right here, as I said, it's a bit messy for development purposes only. But what it shows is different colours. This is blackbird, common blackbird. And what you can see is that many of the birds that pass through Falsterbo actually head west into the UK or France. And the blue denotes that they were recaught in winter. So you see the birds are moving southwest to winter in the UK, and then they're moving northeast to breed in places like Finland. So actually, the birds that we're catching at Falsterbo is just a point on their migration, sort of like the arrows I showed in the earlier slide, where the birds are simply passing through on their way to their wintering quarters, and then they'll head back to their breeding grounds. So that the ringing recoveries give us a nice idea, not only of where birds are going, but also the time of year and the movements that they're making. Ringing also helps us to work out, just like the migration counts do, helps us to work out population trends. So this is lesser whitethroat, a small species of warbler that breeds quite commonly in Sweden. And you can see, again, there's peaks and troughs here, but by and large, the population is remaining stable of lesser whitethroat. That's in contrast to common chiffchaff, where you can see, both in spring and in autumn, the population really over the last decade or two has skyrocketed. And this fits with data that we know from breeding bird surveys of common chiffchaff colonizing southern Sweden. And we can see that in the ringing data here. In contrast, willow warbler is starting to decrease. There were some very high years when ringing started in the 1980s, and there's been a slower decline since. But again, that fits with what we're seeing, with the willow warbler population starting to be pushed a little further north by climate change. And we're seeing those effects in the number of birds migrating through Falsterbo. And then finally, blue tit. So I mentioned there were some peaks and troughs in lesser whitethroat. That's just part of the sort of normal variation. These peaks and troughs that you see here are much more extreme. And that's because blue tit isn't always a migratory species, but in some years, following a good breeding season and a crash of beech mast or similar seed crops, then these birds undergo an eruption. And these sort of peaks here that you see, particularly in 2012, these are eruption years for the species. And so you can see that in some years, the numbers ringed in the autumn are in the low hundreds. And then in other years, they're up over 18,000. And 2012 was an absolute exceptional year. We had, I've got it written down here. Let's see the number. We had 2,178 on a single day ringed, and close to 19,000 in the year. And you can see the following year, 2013, that number dropped down to below 2,000. So it's sorry, just above 2,000. So it's quite dramatic, these swings in the eruption years and the sort of troughs that then follow. Something else we can do, this again touches back on the moult talk that I gave, is to look at the age demographics of the birds that we're catching. And that's quite important because that allows us to work out the breeding success of species that are coming from areas that we might not necessarily have access to. So these are common redstart. This is an adult and a juvenile, locally bred juvenile, as it turns out. But by being able to age the birds that we're catching, we can use that as a proxy for many young and few adults means a good breeding season, whereas many adults and few young means a poor breeding season. And as I said, some of these birds were coming from northern Sweden, Finland, Russia even, and we can sort of extrapolate that to work out how the breeding was. When the birds return in spring, we can then use the data we collect to measure another metric, and that's working out the survival rate. So we know how many birds we ringed in the autumn. In this case, these birds have migrated to Africa and back, and we can use retrap rates to work out how well the birds are surviving over the winter. And again, if there's a difference in the survival of young birds versus adult birds. There's another use of ringing, and that's the phenology, when the birds migrate, when they first turn up. So here in orange, we've got data for common chiffchaff. We've seen common chiffchaff is increasing. So what I've done here is I've made this a percentage, so it's sort of fair and comparable year by year. But if you take the data from 2018 in orange and you take the data from 1980 when the ringing first began in blue, you can see that the arrival and the peak of arrival have both shifted by a week or two earlier in 2018 compared to in 1980. And what we find is not surprisingly, with these short distance migrants, common chiffchaff winters around the Mediterranean, they are arriving earlier, probably because they're detecting cues and clues when they're down in the Mediterranean. You know, if the weather's warm there, they can move. But we're not really finding that in long distance migrants. The common red start, for example, that we just saw, their arrival dates haven't really changed much, probably because they're south of the Sahara. They don't really get those sort of clues as to what the weather is doing, and they just have to go on the date that the population has always gone on. So we can use this to start working out those changes, and obviously these changes have an important part in the success of the species given climate change and so on. I suspect that, you know, within 10 years even, this talk would be quite a different talk. I've spoken at length about putting a small aluminium ring on a bird's leg and then waiting for it to basically be refound somewhere. With the advent of tracking technology, we can get as much data from a single bird as from 45 years of putting rings on birds' legs. And so the observatory is involved in some projects. This is a blackbird tagging project using real-time GPS, actually, so we can see every day or two where these birds have gone to. And it's throwing up some interesting results. We found that some birds do fly directly across the sea to winter in the UK, whereas others will head south into Germany before they then head west and across. And so we're sort of filling in the blanks of that sort of vague endpoint data that we have from ringing. The observatory is involved in quite a lot of things as well. We do guidings for school groups of pensioners and so on. It's famous down here. If you go and speak to school kids, most of them at some point in their life will have had a robin shown to them like this. We tell the kids about the ringing and so on, but what they really want to see is the birds being ringed and then released. So this is something that's really important for us at the observatory. We get a few thousand people come through every year, so it's a good sort of public relations education part. And we also do youth training. So this is me teaching a youngster how to ring and the importance of ringing. So we try and make sure that we're giving back to the community and also sort of setting the groundwork for the future. So that's the first part of this, which is sort of the history of the observatory and what we're doing, the work that we're doing there. And then just to give you a flavor, I'm going to rattle through some birds likely, some birds not so likely at the observatory. This one I popped in because this is down at Falsterbo at the moment. This is a Stella's Ida, rare visitor to Sweden. The population in the Baltic tends to stay in the east, and then otherwise you have to go to northern Norway. So it's pretty unusual to get one of these down here, and even more unusual to get this adult male. And even more unusual is this, which I believe is the first time the three species of Ida, of European Ida, so this on the left is Stella's Ida, and then in the middle, female common Ida, and on the right is a king Ida. I believe it's the first time the three species have ever been seen together, and certainly photographed together in Sweden. So that's going on at the moment, but generally Falsterbo in winter is a pretty quiet, pretty bleak place. We get some sea ducks, some wildfowl, and so on. But through sort of December, January, February, everything down there is quite calm. Early spring, sort of March time, we start to get numbers of, this is common Ida again, but these are migrating birds. We start to get big flocks of Ida migrating past the peninsula. And it's not sort of until late March that we get some of the early migrants. And actually, for anybody watching this who's in Britain or other parts of Western Europe, we get a lot of birds passing through that you don't necessarily think of as migrants. So things like robins, dunnocks, this is a wren, a Eurasian wren. A lot of these migrate. We get quite big numbers migrating through the peninsula, whereas in other areas of Europe, they're sedentary. So these are the first migrants. These are the first signs of returning spring for us. And then it's not until April until we start getting the long distance migrants. Late April, we get willow warblers. This is lesser whitethroat. For the Americans watching this, these are our warblers, and we're very, very proud of our warblers. Thank you very much. This is one of the species I showed you the graph for before. Beautiful species like this redback shrike. This is a bird that arrives in May. Again, a migrant from southern Africa, from south of the Sahara, and breeds across Sweden. Common rosefinch as well. Small numbers migrate through in May. Wryneck. This is a very strange species of woodpecker. It spends most of its time on the ground rather than in trees, and has this habit when you catch them for ringing, they sort of swing their neck around. But yeah, really nice bird, cryptic plumage, nice bird to see. Shorebirds as well, waders. These are sandlings. These tend to migrate through actually quite late, sort of early June sometimes, presumably waiting for the last bit of thawing to happen on their Arctic Siberian breeding grounds. So we get numbers of these passing through. Collared flycatcher turns up from time to time. We have pied flycatcher, which is much commoner, but from time to time we get collared flycatcher. This is a male, the females are brown. Barred warbler as well, another species of warbler that passes through. And greenish warbler, not terribly greenish, but slightly less green than green warbler, I suppose. So we get a couple of these pass through every year as well. Summer things quieten down a little bit, but we have a colony of sandwich terns and pied avocets as well. I've popped this photo in. It's not the best photo of an avocet that I've got, but I kind of like watch the juvenile, and I'll show you the next one in the sequence. This juvenile was a matter of a day old or something, maybe even a little bit less, still getting on its feet. So here it is in one frame, and there it is in the next, still working out how its legs work. Autumn then is it gets going. The first signs of autumn with starlings, common starlings. Common starlings in Sweden are migrants. Most move out over the winter. We get big flocks moving through in late summer. And that's the first sign that autumn is on its way. It's followed by other species like grey heron. Sometimes we can have 100, 200 grey herons migrating in a day in late summer, which is quite impressive to see. You go down to the peninsula at dusk, and you'll see flocks heading out to sea. Swifts as well, common swifts. They start moving through sort of July time, sometimes in really impressive numbers. This, by the way, in the background is the Öresund Bridge. If any of you have watched the Scandinois murder mystery series, The Bridge, this is the bridge of that series. So here we go. Here's a particularly impressive day, late summer. There's drizzle, a lot of midges in the air, and there were hundreds of thousands of common swifts just slowly moving their way through the peninsula. And this view was 360 degrees. This was all around. All as far as I could see, common swifts, not for want of trying to pick something else out, but really, really impressive migration. Yellow wagtails as well move through, sometimes tens of thousands in some cases, often accompanied by tree pipits. Another common breeder in Sweden that migrates. This one and the yellow wagtail both go to sub-Saharan Africa for the winter. So both of these move through in quite big numbers early in the autumn. And it's not just birds. We also get insects moving through. This Camberwell beauty, which in some years can be seen actively migrating actually down the coast. Those red admirals, painted ladies, you can follow the stream of them moving along the beach and heading south and out across the ocean. Scarcities turn up. This is penduline tit. Penduline tit's really interesting at Falsterbo. They don't breed, but they turn up late in the summer. They molt, and then they go back to the breeding grounds, and then they come back again to migrate in about September or October. We know that through colouring birds that have been able to be tracked. Spotted crake, probably not that rare actually at Falsterbo, but seldom seen. Sort of the equivalent of North American Sora. They're around, but more often they turn up in the traps that we put out for ringing. Red-throated pipit, more often heard than seen, but we've managed to ring a few of them as well, probably passing through in bigger numbers than we realise. We're only picking a few up with the call. This is an interesting bird. This is a paddy field warbler. It was ringed late one summer with a brood patch. A brood patch basically means that the bird somewhere has eggs or had eggs. So the indication was that it had tried to breed somewhere nearby. That was unusual in itself. The bird hung around for a little bit. 2 years later, almost to the day, we recaught the same bird in the same patch of reed bed with a brood patch again. So, once might have just been coincidence that this bird had tried to breed somewhere and got blown off course and got caught. But the fact that we caught it twice and it had a brood patch both times, it suggests that this species is breeding, or at least trying to breed, probably somewhere in southern Sweden, if not, Finland or somewhere around the Baltics. But yeah, really, really fascinating bird. We don't know any more than that. We can only speculate. But yeah, a rarity with an interesting story. And another rarity with, I love to say, an interesting story, a sad story actually. This is yellow-breasted bunting. This is from September 2012. This used to be a species that bred in Sweden. Actually, it was scarce, but it bred in Sweden. Bred commonly in Finland. The population has absolutely crashed, and this is one of only 2 yellow-breasted buntings seen in Sweden this millennium, and is the last sighting of the species in Sweden. So it's sort of bittersweet that we caught this amazing rarity, but almost sort of the last of its kind to be seen here. As David sort of alluded to with his background there, Falsterbo really is about honey buzzards and raptors in general. And Falsterbo Bird Show used to be called Honey Buzzard Day, and for good reason. That weekend, that sort of last weekend of August, first weekend of September, if you turn up at Falsterbo during that period, you've got a great chance of seeing good numbers of honey buzzards. And just last year, there was a day with, I think it was the Saturday of the bird show, with close to 9,000 passing through. Typically big days, a couple of thousand. But really, really impressive when you have these constant streams of honey buzzards passing through. Red kites as well. Red kite is a conservation success story in Sweden. Similar to the UK, numbers were down to just a few. And I think there was some, I think I'm right in saying there were some reintroductions. But here are the numbers passing through Falsterbo in the autumn from 1973 to 2020. And you can see now they're a common bird in the autumn. It was only a couple of decades ago that they were pretty scarce passing through. Hobby as well, plenty of hobbies going through. This one has a dragonfly in its talons there. Really, really impressive to see them catching dragonflies in flight. This one was just over the bird station. Hen harrier as well. And I've included this photo. You can see the sort of views that you get of the birds. This is right down at the southern point. So this bird is about to head out and across to Denmark, and it's passing by a group of admirers there. Pallid harrier as well. Pallid harrier, I'll pull up the graph there. Pallid harrier has increased dramatically too. The species have actually started breeding in Finland. We know from ringing recoveries that some of the birds that have been ringed in the nest in Finland have migrated through Falsterbo. So we assume that's where most of our population coming from. But really, really beautiful bird, and always fantastic to see. There was one day last autumn when I think we had seven or eight go through in a single day, which you can see in the 70s or 80s that would have been unthinkable. Black kite as well, much scarcer than red kite. For those who are interested, something intriguing going on with the black kites here. This sort of big white base to the hand here, and the heavy streaking underneath. These are almost sort of eastern, I think what are being called Central Siberian black kites these days. So a little different to the birds that you get in Southern Europe. More study required, but something intriguing happening with the black kites that breed and pass through Sweden. Sparrowhawk as well. Days with three-figure counts of sparrowhawks are not unusual in the right weather conditions in the autumn. Generally, sort of following the finch migration and so on, feeding as they move along, and common buzzard as well in all shades. So there's a couple of common buzzards, and again, big numbers, hundreds can migrate through in a single day. Of the smaller birds, the commoner species in autumn are robin. Robin passes through. We generally catch a couple of thousand robins every season. European robin, goldcrest as well is, as they said on Blue Peter. Here's one we ringed earlier. So goldcrest, a couple of thousand goldcrests generally ringed in the autumn too. Blue tit. You've seen the graphs for blue tit, and here's one that we ringed. And when you catch that number of birds, you often end up with oddities. This is one that's lacking the melanin. If I flick back here, you can see that strong face pattern, that black face pattern on this one, and this is completely lacking it. So quite a striking bird. This turned up in 2012. We caught this one. Not a great photo, but for those of you who are used to seeing blue tits and great tits just sort of stationary and hanging around the garden, this is a small flock migrating. Blue tits on the left there, and the bottom right, and a great tit sort of the right hand side. And they sort of bound along low, occasionally dash down into the bushes and so on. But as we've seen from the ringing recoveries, they cross the water. They will make it across the Denmark. Long-eared owl as well. We actually catch a remarkable number of long-eared owls. There was one night when we caught 70 in a single night. A typical number might just be sort of 15, 20 on a good night. But it's remarkable when you go out and you catch that number of long-eared owls. Not quite so common, but short-eared owl, we generally catch a few every year. Some interesting recoveries of these. We had one that had been ringed in the nest in the Netherlands that we recaught. And recent studies with trackers have shown that they're really nomadic. Birds will breed in Scotland and then move on to have a second brood in Norway, for example. There's a really interesting paper from British Trust for Ornithology on that's worth looking up. Tengmalm's owl, or boreal owl if you're in North America. Eruptive, so some years we'll catch them and some years we won't. Great Grey Shrike as well, probably the worst bird to catch. That beak is lethal, actually, and the claws are pretty sharp too. Nutcracker, what's better than one nutcracker? Two, obviously. Here's a couple that we caught for ringing. They're seen most years. They tend to not cross the water, so they'll sort of fly along the peninsula, buzz around a little bit, and then head back inland. Wood pigeon as well, the humble wood pigeon. We can have days with 100,000 passing through, and the flocks sort of shimmer like silver clouds. Is actually one of the most impressive sights at Falsterbo. You know, one wood pigeon is pretty common and pretty unremarkable, but a flock of a couple of tens of thousands is really impressive. Just to give you a sense of what it looks like. And then the finches, which for me, I think are the stars of the show when it comes to migration at Falsterbo. That period, end of September, start of October, is when the finches start to move. Best conditions are, you'll see in these photos, sort of grey skies, a brisk southwesterly wind, and you can get some impressive numbers. This is siskin, Eurasian siskin. There's one tree sparrow hiding in the centre there as well. Which didn't migrate. They don't particularly like to cross water, but skins have no problem crossing water. Goldfinches as well, European goldfinch. Not so many of these, couple of thousand of these go through, but impressive to see flocks like this. Bramblings. Bramblings are quite common. and they're often in the company of chaffinches. This is far from the most impressive photo of a chaffinch, but some days we can get up to 500,000 chaffinches and bramblings go through. And then I'm going to push the technology a little bit in a second. Let's see, this one here. Hopefully this will play. Otherwise, I'll do my best to describe it. But this is standing at the very southernmost point of Falsterbo Peninsula, looking north along the west side of the peninsula. And this scene, this sort of spectacle of just flock after flock after flock of chaffinch coming through, this continues from not long after dawn until early afternoon. So let's see if this goes. And you can see this just goes on for as far as you can see. And you're stood there and you just have thousands upon thousands of chaffinches passing by you. This is then looking back from the north-south to that spot that I was at. And there's the people watching migration. And it's hard to convey unless you're there, because you've got the noise as well. You've got the sound of all of these finches calling as they go. You've got predatory sparrowhawks darting through them from time to time, and just every direction you look in, it's just chaffinches for as far as you can see. You set the telescope up and you look out to sea, and all you can see is chaffinches. And these days when we have these 500,000, sometimes more birds passing through, they only happen 2-3 times in an average year, but they're absolutely sort of the pinnacle of migration. And if anybody has the chance to ever get across to Falsterbo, we can talk a little more about this, but by all means contact me, and we'll see if we can sort of connect you with some of this absolutely mind-blowing mass migration that goes on there.
Right, you caught me short there. Wow. I mean, I've had the pleasure, as I said, of being at Falsterbo and actually seeing some of those flocks fly through. And I've also marveled at the numbers of, for example, sparrowhawks. You know, as you say, they're just everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's a sparrowhawk flying up. Got a few questions for you, actually.
Yeah.
After looking at your presentation, the first is, can you speak Swedish?
Jag kan prata lite, men
Okay.
inte bra.
All right, okay.
I can speak a little bit, but it's not very good.
I think you're Swedish.
For any Swedes watching the YouTube video, comment below.
Yeah, I think your Swedish sounds better than my Spanish. Now, a few questions about some of the birds we've been talking about. But before that, actually, let's talk about ringing itself. I've actually seen you doing ringing demonstrations at Falsterbo. I've got a picture of you holding 2 or 3 sedge warblers. How does for the layperson, how does the ringing in Falsterbo in Sweden differ from the ringing in the UK or the US in terms of the techniques and the way it's sort of managed?
Mostly it doesn't. That's there's some slightly different terminology in what we do, but you know, that's sort of by the by. In America, you have to open the rings before you close them again. In Europe, we have the luxury of them coming pre-opened. But no, otherwise it's pretty much the same standard all the way through, and sort of by design, really, because you have Euroring, which coordinates European ringing, and so all of the ringing schemes in Spain as well and other countries work to this same standard. And we know, for us particularly, we ring a bird and it turns up a couple of hours later in Denmark, and sometimes it will literally be caught a couple of hours later in Denmark and logged. So making sure that you have that same practical standard through all the countries means that then everything's comparable. We're measuring the wing, at least in Europe, we're measuring the wing in the same way through Europe. So it means that if I measure the wing of a bird in Sweden and it's recaught in the UK or it's recaught in Spain, it's the same methodology is being used. That differs slightly in America, but by and large, it's the same procedure and the same protocol.
And in terms of the actual ringing itself, I mean, in the UK, it takes forever and a day. I mean, literally, to become qualified. And other places I've been to, I mean, I remember once being in Peru, watching a guy quite expertly catching ant pitters and hummingbirds. And I asked him, how long you've been doing it? And he said 6 months. Basically,
Mm-hmm,
I've
mm-hmm,
just been thrown out here. I'm volunteering. Someone showed me how to do it a few times, and now I'm doing it.
mm-hmm.
Do you think? I mean, I don't know if you can answer this question without sort of criminalizing yourself amongst the ringing world, but do you think it is so necessary to spend such a long time? Because I always felt, especially in Britain, that it was a bit of a privilege only for people that can afford to do it, because you have to pay for all the equipment and stuff, and it's like 7 years or whatever if you want to become a ringer of all birds. And I think that puts people off. I mean, it puts me off. If I had to do, I mean, I'd love to be, to learn how to ring, but I haven't got 7 years to do that.
Mm-hmm,
So, what do
mm-hmm.
you think about that?
There's a question that's got a lot to unpack in there. There's multiple questions within one. So you're right. It is a privileged hobby. I'm going to call it a hobby. To varying degrees in different countries, you have it being more hobbyist and more professional. But most people who are doing it enjoy doing it. If you want to come out to Falsterbo, we, in general terms, we will train people and so on. But you have to get the ticket, and you have to be able to afford, both financially and in terms of time in life, to be able to come and be at Falsterbo for 3 or 4 months. So there is a degree of privilege there. It is something that should theoretically be open to everybody, but in actual fact, it's not. One of the reasons that training takes so long is not actually so much to do with sort of learning every aspect of aging and moult and identification. A lot of it is to do with safely handling the bird. That's something that actually, this, you said, was Peru, right? You had somebody who was just kind of there ringing. There are some countries that don't have organized ringing schemes. They don't have central bodies that take care of things. And I will say, perhaps slightly controversially, but the standard of animal welfare is often lower in these places as well. Whereas if you look at the standard within Europe, the priority is you have to be able to safely, first of all, extract from the net and then handle and then take measurements from that bird without doing any damage to that bird. And this is always a controversial thing. People ask, does it stress the bird? Yeah, of course it does. Of course it does. You catch it, you handle it, you take it into a ringing hook, you put a ring on its leg. Of course it stresses the bird. I don't think there's any, there's no way of getting around that. But there are studies that have shown that stress doesn't last. And that's quite important. That stress doesn't last, but if damage to the bird, if you damage the bird's feathers or something, that does last. And then there's a sort of ethical and moral requirement that we don't do that. If we're experimenting with animals, fundamentally what this is, you have a moral obligation to not cause any damage or any undue stress. But then if you look at that purely from a scientific point of view, we want to know, what does this bird do? Where does that bird go? And so to do that, if you take this bird and you somehow damage that bird in a way, you're not going to get accurate data. If you take a bunch of birds and you damage their tail feathers so much that they can't go on their normal migratory route, you're going to find these birds sort of within half a mile of where you ring them, and that's not going to be natural behavior. So a lot of this long training that takes place, particularly the BTO in the UK have a good system for this. The same here in Sweden. You have to be licensed to do this, is to sort of maintain that standard of welfare and to minimize any stress and to remove any damage while you're ringing the birds. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's that degree of stress, but also to acknowledge that what we're finding out, and particularly now we can put these very lightweight trackers on, which are, you know, in weight ratio terms are not really any different from wearing a sort of heavy wristwatch or something like that. The data that feeds into conservation for things like how birds are dealing with climate change and things like that, I think far outweighs that moment of stress that bird has. As I say, I think it's important to admit that. I think it's important to acknowledge that bird is stressed at that moment, but that's not long lasting. And so, yeah, the training, to sort of answer your question, the training needs to continue and the training needs to be at that level. It does add a degree of sort of privilege and a degree of a barrier for some people getting through. But if that's the trade-off against maintaining the standard, then that's an important thing to do.
Okay. The tracking tech that you discussed earlier, how does that affect ringing? Does that not negate ringing in the end of the day?
So in my opinion, no, because we have to look at this from different sort of standpoints. So is it going to make redundant the need to sort of recapture lots of birds to work out where they're going? Yeah, it is, because we're going to get that data from the GPS tracks and so on. Just to sort of add a side note to this, there are different technologies, some of which require the bird to be recaught so that the data can be downloaded. At the moment, Blackbird is about as small as we can get and have a GPS tag on it, so one that goes up to a satellite and back. Anything smaller than that, we still have to recatch the bird to get the data. Fundamentally, you still have to catch the bird in the first place to put that tracker on, and you still have to know about that species. We can't just sort of go out and catch a bunch of birds and put a bunch of taggers on and set them loose and then look at the data and say, oh, I don't actually know what species that was or what age that was. So this is when people say, you know, is it going to replace ringing? No, it will replace the need to read the metal ring number on its leg to work out where the bird has gone. But if we want to work out, for example, you know, common chiffchaffs, if we want to work out eventually, if we get to the point where we can put tags on common chiffchaffs, we probably get a couple of different populations passing through Falsterbo. We get different ages, different sexes. And without those skills to be able to identify and distinguish between those populations and the ages and the sexes, the data is just going to end up being a sort of muddled mess. So we still, to go back to the previous question, we still need those handling and those welfare skills, and we still need the sort of skills that that ringers have in being able to identify the birds in the first place, and then age and sex, and take data and all of this sort of stuff that you don't get from GPS tracks. It's just that GPS tracks are sort of the new next level replacement for where does the bird actually go.
Okay. Now, out there, we all know that there are people who are birders who have an abject dislike, for put it a light way, for ringers and ringing. Why do you think this, and how do you counter that?
Yeah, that's difficult because I've spoken to some people about this, and the argument, as I say, I think we need to admit that, yeah, there's some stress caused. I think trying to sort of say, no, this bird is quite happy to be held there and ringed. I don't think that's a good way to go. The situation I've always had when I've met these people who are against ringing is that you get down to it and fundamentally they say, yeah, but I just don't like it. I just don't like to see a bird with a ring on its leg. That's often the sort of fundamental, deep-rooted view that they have, and you know, it's tricky to argue against something that fundamentally is an opinion. of somebody. I can put forward, as I said, all of the scientific knowledge that we've gained from ringing and that we will continue to gain. I'm a big supporter of, as I've said, making sure that it's done in a correct way. I've sent people home for when I've been training at Falsterbo. I've been with people who they just can't handle a bird. You can see they don't have the motor skills to be able to handle it, and I will tell them, you're not going to be a ringer. Go home, effectively, or watch. If you want to watch, you're welcome to watch, but you're not going to be a ringer. Once you put into place all of those sort of safeguards and so on, and you go down that, and you still have people who fundamentally don't agree with it, it's hard to sort of argue back the case at that point, because it's I will always have my opinion that it is valuable, and they have their opinion that it's not, and you sort of reach a stalemate.
Yeah, there's also people that complain in UK, certainly, that there's people out ringing rarities when they show up. That's the impression they get, and for me, I think that's against the actual rules, isn't it? You're not supposed to be just pitching up.
So you can in the UK, if you're within a bird observatory recording area, you can ring anything, but you shouldn't target rarities. And I think that's fair enough, because I think that there is minimal value actually to ringing many of these rarities. There's cases to be said for things like Richard pipits, where there appears to be populations wintering now in Europe and sort of returning and so on, and some of these species, but purely targeting a one-off. The flip side to that, though, I have to say, is that there are many of the same people who disagree with that are sort of hanging on the identification of a bird, waiting for it to be caught and ringed so that the identification can be cemented. So there are people who have the view one way or the other, and that's absolutely fine, but there seems to be a degree of sort of preferential flexibility in some of these cases.
Yeah, we can talk so much. In fact, we're going to have a lot of questions in the Q&A, because I myself have several that I want to talk to you about. But I want to ask you very, very quickly. I want to ask you, I know I've already asked you before, but I'm going to ask you again, just in case there's been a change since I last saw you. What is your favorite bird?
I'm going to stick with my answer as last time, the common redstart, but I've got another one that's a surprise close, maybe a second. So I was lucky enough I have in-laws in South America, so I was lucky enough to spend the last month in the summer of the Southern Hemisphere. And when I was there, I saw a family of torrent ducks. And torrent ducks they're fantastic. They're sort of intricately patterned. They live on these fast-flowing streams, and so they were quite high on my wish list to see. But what I hadn't appreciated was the behaviour, and this pair had 3 chicks there, and imagine these sort of really rapid rivers that they're on, and the chicks just they sort of motor across the water like a little clockwork mouse. They're absolute. I was mesmerized by them. You see them in the books, and yeah, they're going to be a nice bird to see. But actually seeing that behavior and seeing how these chicks that were still, they had a sort of long tail sticking out the back, but really they were sort of fluffy and downy, and they're on this turbulent water, and they're just sort of, skittering across the top of the water, almost like a stone that's been skimmed. Really, so they, I saw hundreds of species out there, and many absolutely fantastic birds, tanagers and things like that. But the torrent ducks were the ones that stuck in my mind for being sort of, you expect them to be good, you expect them to be 10 out of 10, and they end up being a sort of 11. They're really fantastic. So
yeah, it's amazing how they can swim against the current upstream. It's incredible. And my final question to you is, if you had £1 million, euros, or dollars, and you had to spend it on conservation, what would you spend it on?
Yeah, I mean, it's not enough, is it? That's the answer. It's not enough. People have asked me before, what do I think is the single most effective thing that you could do to help conservation? And I think the usual answers are, I don't know, plant more hedgerows, or do this, or do that. Change the government. Change the government is the answer, and that applies, I think, for pretty much every country in the world, doesn't it? As I say, £1 million is not going to be enough for that. I think that I'm not allowed to swear on here, am I? I think I think we're absolutely fucked unless the government changes. I think the absolutely needs to be action from the top, because otherwise, all of the NGOs, all of the conservationists, everybody who's working, they're working against the tide, right? They're doing their best to counter the actions of governments and industries and so on and so forth. And I think unless governments actually take conservation as a serious priority, and this is not just sort of greenwashing and then rowing back on things. This is actually taking it as a priority. Then we ain't going to get anywhere. So that's where the 1 million goes as a drop in the ocean for changing the government in the right direction.
Yeah, maybe the 1 million can go towards forming a new party, because we need a change. Okay, well, listen, I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to you talking about Falsterbo, a place that I have some experience of myself. And as Stephen says, if you want to get yourself out there, contact him and just go and experience that amazing migration. It's just incredible. And it's not just in the air, it's in the bushes, on the ground, it's everywhere, and across the water. It's fantastic. Stephen, thank you so much for sparing your evening tonight to talk to us about Falsterbo.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me back.
And Zoomers, thank you very much for being here. There's plenty more coming up over the next period of time. If you're watching this in the future, there's a ton of interviews to look at. But if you want to check out the website, theurbanbirdworld.com, you'll find the upcoming conversations due. So until we all meet again, take it easy, keep looking up is the message.